The first thing I noticed was the pounding in my skull, relentless and unforgiving, like a jackhammer inside my brain. My mouth felt like sandpaper, and the sour taste of whiskey clung to my tongue. I groaned, squinting against the blinding sunlight streaming through the window. Except it wasn't my window. Panic bubbled up as I sat up too quickly, my head spinning. I blinked, trying to piece together where I was. The room was small and dingy, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that hit me like a slap. The kind of place you only end up in if you're running from something or running to forget. A battered nightstand sat beside the bed, topped with a lamp that flickered intermittently. A garish pamphlet caught my eye. "Welcome to St. Louis." St. Louis? What the hell? My phone was dead, sitting on the nightstand beside my wallet. I grabbed it, fumbling for the charger I always carried, and plugged it into the wall. While it powered on, I racked my brain, trying to remember how I'd ended up here. Images flashed in my mind, disjointed, blurry fragments of last night. Claire's face twisted with anger, her voice sharp and cutting. "You don't even see what's right in front of you, Evan. You're blind." Her words stung, though I hadn't understood what she meant at the time. I'd stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind me. The rest was a haze of whiskey, shouting, and nothing. My phone buzzed to life, pulling me out of my thoughts. Dozens of missed notifications flooded the screen, but one stood out. A text from Claire. "We need to talk. You deserve to know the truth." My stomach churned as I stared at the message. What truth? I hid her name in my contacts, the phone trembling in my hands as it rang. She picked up on the second ring. "Evan," she said, her voice heavy with something I couldn't quite place. "Claire," I said, my words clipped. "What the hell is going on? How did I end up in St. Louis? And what's this about the truth?" There was a long pause on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost trembling. "I've been sleeping with Nick. For years." I froze, the room spinning around me. "Nick? My twin brother." My grip on the phone tightened as Claire's words echoed in my ears. "I've been sleeping with Nick. For years. Nick? My twin brother. Are you out of your mind?" I said, my voice rising. "Please tell me you're joking, Claire. Please tell me this is some sick joke." "I wish I could," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But it's the truth. You deserve to know." "I deserve to know?" I repeated, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "I've been married to you for 10 years. We have a son, Claire, and you're telling me this now? Over the phone?" "It started before we got married," she said, her voice cracking. "I didn't know how to stop it, Evan. It kept happening. I couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, my head spinning. This couldn't be real. Not Nick. Not my own brother." "How long?" I demanded, my voice cold. 7 years, she said after a pause. "Maybe 8. I clenched my teeth, the betrayal cutting deeper with every word. 7 years. 7 years of lies. Of betrayal. While I was working late providing for my family, I couldn't finish the thought. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice low and sharp. "Evan, please don't." "Where is he, Claire?" I barked, my patience gone. She hesitated, and I could almost hear her weighing her options. "I don't know," she finally said. "I haven't spoken to him since." "Since what?" "Since he told me he wanted to come clean," she admitted. "He said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore." "Guilt?" I laughed bitterly. Now he's worried about guilt? Unbelievable. I hung up without another word, the phone slipping from my hand and landing on the bed. My mind raced, every nerve in my body screaming for answers. Nick had always been the charming one, the golden boy who could do no wrong. People flocked to him, drawn to his charisma and easygoing demeanor. And now I realized so had my wife. After a cold shower to clear my head, I gathered my things and checked out of the motel. My car was parked haphazardly in the lot, a dent on the side that I didn't remember. Great. Another mystery to solve. The drive back to Chicago felt endless. Every mile was a reminder of what I'd lost, of the betrayal I couldn't escape. Images of Nick and Claire together kept flashing in my mind. Laughing, whispering, sharing moments that were supposed to be mine. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the anger had simmered into something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about Claire or Nick anymore. It was about me, about what I was going to do to make them pay. I wasn't the kind of man who let things slide. Not this. The house was eerily quiet when I stepped inside. Claire's shoes were by the door, her jacket draped over the chair. She was in the kitchen, her back to me as she rinsed a plate in the sink. She turned when she heard me, her face pale. "Evan, don't," I said, holding up a hand. "Don't try to explain. Don't apologize. Just tell me where Nick is." "I don't know," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. I stared at her, searching for any sign of the woman I'd married. But all I saw was a stranger, a liar who destroyed everything we'd built together. "You don't get to play the victim here," I said, my voice cold. "You and Nick made your choices. Now you get to live with them." Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't care. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. As I sat in my car, the weight of it all pressed down on me. Claire had betrayed me. Nick had betrayed me. But they hadn't broken me. Not yet. I sat in my car for what felt like hours, staring at the steering wheel. The house loomed behind me like a monument to everything that had been ripped apart. Every time I thought I'd hit the peak of my anger, something deeper, darker, would pull me under again. Nick. Of all people, Nick. We'd grown up inseparable. Two halves of the same whole. When one of us got into trouble, the other would cover. When one of us struggled, the other was there to pull him up. That's how it was supposed to be, wasn't it? But now, the memories of shared birthdays and childhood adventures were tainted by the image of him with Claire. I slammed my fist against the dashboard, the sharp pain in my knuckles grounding me. Nick had always been the golden boy, the charming one, the one people gravitated to without even trying. It had been like that our whole lives. I thought back to the last time I'd seen him, a month ago at a family barbecue. He'd laughed and joked like nothing was wrong, throwing a football with Jamie in the backyard. My stomach churned at the thought. How many of those moments were just lies? And Jamie? I didn't know where I was driving until I found myself in front of my parents' house. Their home had always been a sanctuary, but now, even that felt tainted. I rang the doorbell, and Mom answered, her face lighting up. "Evan, what a surprise. Come in." She didn't seem to notice the storm brewing in my eyes as she led me to the living room. Dad was in his recliner, half watching a baseball game on TV. "What's the occasion?" Mom asked, settling on the couch. I didn't respond right away. My fists clenched as I searched for the words, the anger bubbling just beneath the surface. "Where's Nick?" I finally asked. Mom frowned. "I think he mentioned something about a work trip." "Why?" I let out a bitter laugh. "A work trip? That's rich." "Evan," Dad said, sitting up. "What's going on?" I looked between them, my parents' faces etched with concern, and something inside me broke. "Nick's been sleeping with Claire," I said, my voice shaking. "For years." Mom's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide. "Evan, no, that can't be true." "It's true," I said coldly. Claire admitted it. 7 years, maybe 8. They've been sneaking around behind my back. Dad leaned forward, his face grim. "Are you sure about this? Do you think I'd make something like this up?" I snapped, my voice rising. The room fell in a heavy silence, broken only by the faint sound of the TV. Mom shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't understand. Nick would never do something like this. You two are so close." "Not anymore," I said bitterly. I stood, the weight of their disappointment pressing down on me. "I just thought you should know what kind of son you raised," I said, heading for the door. "Evan, wait," Mom called after me. But I didn't wait. I couldn't. The drive back to my house was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of revenge. Nick had taken everything from me, my trust, my marriage, my family. He'd stolen years of my life without a second thought. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house. Claire was still inside, probably waiting for me to cool off. But I wasn't going to cool off. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. By the time I walked back into the house, my anger had turned cold. Claire was in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "Evan," she started, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but Don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want to hear it. You made your choices, Claire. Now, I get to make mine." She flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. Her tears didn't move me anymore. I went upstairs to the bedroom, shutting the door behind me. I needed space to think, to plan. Claire and Nick thought they'd won, that they could trample over me and walk away unscathed. But they were wrong. The first thing I did was grab my laptop and start digging. I needed to understand just how far their betrayal went. Claire had admitted to the affair, but there were always more lies hiding beneath the surface. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Claire's phone backup had synced to our shared cloud account, a detail she must have forgotten. As I scrolled through her messages, my stomach churned. The texts between her and Nick were damning. Nick, last night was amazing. I wish it could always be like this. Claire, me too. I hate sneaking around. Nick, we'll figure it out. He won't suspect a thing. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to keep reading. The messages went back years, a detailed record of their deception. They joked about me, mocked my long work hours, even made plans to meet while I was out of town. And then I found something that made my blood run cold. Nick, do you think Jamie knows? He's smart for his age. Claire, no. He's too young to understand. And Evan would never believe it anyway. Jamie, my son. I leaned back in my chair, the air rushing out of my lungs. What were they talking about? What wouldn't I believe? An idea crept into my mind, one so horrifying I immediately tried to dismiss it. But the seed was planted, and it wouldn't go away. I opened a new tab and started searching for a local clinic that could do a paternity test. If what I suspected was true, I needed to know. The next morning, I made an appointment. Jamie was with Claire's parents for the weekend, which gave me time to gather what I needed. I collected a few strands of his hair from the comb in his bathroom and sealed them in a plastic bag. The test would take a few days, but I already knew the results would change everything. In the meantime, I started working on the second part of my plan, taking Nick down. My brother had always been the golden boy in the family, but I knew his reputation wasn't spotless. I reached out to an old friend, Marcus, who worked as a private investigator. I need you to look into someone for me, I said over the phone. Who's the target? Marcus asked. My brother. I replied, my voice bitter. Nick Parker. There was a pause on the other end. You sure about this, Evan? That's a serious line to cross. He crossed it first, I said firmly. I just need to know everything. Bank accounts, business deals, anything shady he's been hiding. All right, Marcus said. I'll get back to you in a few days. When I hung up, a strange calm settled over me. For the first time since Claire's confession, I felt like I had some control. Nick thought he was untouchable. Claire thought her lies would never catch up to her. They were both wrong. The days crawled by like molasses as I waited for answers. The paternity test was out of my hands now, and Marcus was working to dig into Nick's life. But the weight of waiting left me restless, my thoughts bouncing between anger, grief, and the cold satisfaction of knowing I was finally taking control. Claire avoided me as much as possible. We'd barely spoken since I found out the truth, and when we did, it was brief and tense. I let her stew in her guilt while I focused on gathering what I needed to expose her and Nick. 3 days later, Marcus called. I've got something for you, he said. Meet me at Benny's Diner. I was out the door in minutes, my heart pounding. The diner was nearly empty when I arrived, and Marcus waved me over to a booth in the back. He slid a manila envelope across the table, his expression serious. What's this? I asked, picking it up. Everything you asked for, Marcus said, leaning back. Nick's not just a cheater, Evan. He's a thief. My stomach tightened as I opened the envelope and sifted through the documents inside. Bank statements, transaction records, and business filings, all pointing to one glaring fact. Nick had been embezzling money from the family business for years. Son of a... I muttered, my hands trembling with anger. He's been funneling money into a shell account, Marcus explained. Small amounts at first, but it's added up. I'd estimate he's taken close to $100 grand. I stared at the evidence, my vision blurring with rage. Nick hadn't just betrayed me personally, he'd betrayed the entire family. What's the next move? Marcus asked. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Expose him. I want the board to see this. Marcus nodded. Consider it done. Later that evening, I sat in my car outside the house, staring at the envelope on the passenger seat. The weight of the betrayal felt heavier now, knowing how far Nick's deceit had gone. As I stepped inside, Claire was in the kitchen, her back to me as she prepared dinner. I set the envelope on the counter, watching her stiffen at the sound. What's that? She asked, turning to face me. Proof, I said coldly. Nick's been stealing from the family business. For years. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something. Shock? Guilt? I didn't know, she said quietly. Of course you didn't, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. You were too busy sneaking around with him to notice. Her face crumpled, but I didn't care. I walked past her, heading upstairs to my room. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. Nick's theft gave me leverage, but it wasn't enough. I needed the results of the paternity test. The truth wasn't just about punishing them. It was about setting myself free. The envelope sat on the counter, daring me to open it. The clinic had sent the results faster than expected, but now that they were here, I wasn't sure if I could handle the truth. My hands trembled as I picked it up, the weight of its contents heavier than anything physical. Jamie's laugh echoed in my mind, his smile so bright and unburdened. No matter what the paper said, he was still my son. I'd raised him, tucked him in at night, cheered at his soccer games. But this wasn't just about biology, it was about betrayal. I took a deep breath and ripped the envelope open. The words on the page blurred as I stared at them, my heart pounding in my chest. I forced myself to focus, scanning the results until I reached the line that shattered everything. Probability of paternity, 0%. I sank into the chair, the paper slipping from my hands. The room spun around me as the truth bore down like a freight train. Jamie wasn't mine. He was Nick's. I don't know how long I sat there, numb and unable to move. All the anger and betrayal I'd felt before seemed like a drop in the ocean compared to this. Claire and Nick had stolen my life, not just my wife but my child. I thought of Jamie, the way he'd call me Dad, with such trust and love. He didn't know. He couldn't know. The thought of breaking his heart was unbearable. Claire found me in the kitchen an hour later, her face pale and her movements hesitant. She must have seen the envelope on the counter, because she froze when she entered the room. "Evan," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Did you?" "Yes," I said, my voice hollow. "I know." She stepped closer, tears welling up in her eyes. "Evan, You lied to me," I interrupted, my tone sharp. "You let me believe he was mine. For 8 years, Claire. 8 years." Her tears spilled over, but I didn't care. She reached out as if to touch my arm, but I pulled back, the anger surging again. "I raised him," I said, my voice rising. "I gave him everything, and all the while, you knew. You and Nick both knew." "I didn't want to hurt you," she sobbed. "You're the only father Jamie has ever known. He loves you, Evan. Please don't take that away from him." Her words stopped me in my tracks. As much as I hated her, as much as I hated Nick, I couldn't bring myself to hate Jamie. None of this was his fault. "He's not losing me," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "But you are." Claire's face crumpled, but I didn't give her a chance to respond. I grabbed the paternity test and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her in tears. That night, I sat in Jamie's room while he slept, watching the gentle rise and fall of his chest. The anger melted away, replaced by a fierce determination. He was my son, no matter what the test said, and I was going to protect him, from Claire, from Nick, and from the lies they'd built around him. The next morning, my resolve was set. The paternity test had confirmed the depth of Claire and Nick's betrayal, but it also gave me clarity. My relationship with Jamie was untouchable. He was my son in every way that mattered, and I wasn't going to let their lies ruin that. But Nick and Claire? They had to pay. I grabbed the manila envelope with the evidence Marcus had collected on Nick and headed straight to the office of Parker & Sons, the family business my father had built from the ground up. Nick might have fooled everyone into thinking he was the perfect golden boy, but I had the proof that would bring his facade crashing down. The boardroom was quiet when I entered, the members seated around the long mahogany table. My father sat at the head, his expression grim. He'd called an emergency meeting after I showed him the documents last night, and now everyone was waiting to hear what I had to say. I set the envelope on the table, the sound loud in the silence. "Nick has been stealing from this company for years," I began, my voice steady. "He's funneled over $100,000 into a private account, hidden under a shell company. Here's the proof." I opened the envelope and laid out the evidence. Bank statements, fake invoices, and wire transfer records. Gasps rippled around the room as the board members leaned forward to examine the documents. "This isn't possible," one of them muttered, his face pale. It's not just possible, I said coldly. It's fact. Nick has been using this company as his personal ATM, and he thought no one would notice. My father's hands trembled as he picked up the records, his face a mask of shock and betrayal. Evan, are you sure about this? Would I be standing here if I wasn't? I replied, my voice hard. The room fell into heavy silence. Finally, my father nodded, his jaw tightening. Call Nick, he said to his assistant. Get him in here now. Nick arrived 20 minutes later, breezing into the room with his usual charm. His confident smile faltered when he saw the looks on everyone's faces. What's going on? He asked, his eyes darting to me. We were hoping you could explain this, I said, sliding the bank statements across the table toward him. Nick picked them up, his expression shifting from confusion to panic. This isn't what it looks like, he stammered. Oh, it's exactly what it looks like, I said, my voice dripping with contempt. You've been stealing from the family business, Nick. And now, everyone knows. The board members erupted into murmurs, their voices overlapping as they processed the revelation. Nick turned to our father, his eyes pleading. Dad, I can explain, he said desperately. Don't, my father said sharply, his voice trembling with barely contained anger. I trusted you, Nick. I trusted you with this company, and you betrayed that trust. Nick looked at me, his expression shifting to something darker. You did this, he hissed. You did this to yourself. I shot back. You stole. You lied. And now, you're finally paying the price. The meeting ended with a unanimous vote to remove Nick from his position. He stormed out of the boardroom, his face red with fury, but I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. This was just the first step. Nick thought he could take everything from me, my wife, my family, my dignity. But I was just getting started. Nick's fury as he stormed out of the boardroom should have been satisfying, but it wasn't. I knew I'd landed a solid blow, but the fight wasn't over yet. The deeper I dug, the more I realized how tangled the lies between Claire and Nick really were. That night, I sat in my home office, combing through more of the files Marcus had sent me. Most of it was straightforward, documents tying Nick to the shell accounts, timelines of his thefts. But then I found something odd, a transaction flagged with the name Clarity Services. It wasn't a name I recognized, but the amount, $5,000, stood out. The transfer was dated a little over a year ago. I called Marcus immediately. Clarity Services, I said as soon as he answered. What is it? Give me a second, Marcus replied, typing furiously in the background. A few moments later, he let out a low whistle. It's a private paternity testing clinic in Chicago. My heart sank, a cold realization creeping over me. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the document over and over, the implications slamming into me like waves. Nick hadn't just stolen from the business. He'd gone behind my back to confirm what I already knew, that Jamie was his son. What did it mean that Nick had sought out the truth for himself? Guilt? Curiosity? Or was he planning something worse? The next morning, I called Claire. She sounded wary as she answered. Evan, she began cautiously. Were you ever going to tell me about the paternity test? I asked coldly. There was silence on the other end, then a shaky sigh. How did you? I know everything, Claire. Don't bother lying to me. She hesitated before answering. Nick insisted on getting the test done last year. He wanted proof. He said he needed to know for sure if Jamie was his. Why? I demanded. Why would he care? I don't know, she said, her voice breaking. He never told me what he planned to do with the results. I told him it didn't matter. That Jamie was better off with you. Better off with me? I repeated, my voice rising. You mean the guy you've been lying to for 8 years? The guy who thought he was raising his own son? Her sobs came through the line, but they didn't move me. I hung up, the cold fury building inside me. Nick had crossed another line, one that threatened the bond I'd fought so hard to maintain with Jamie. If he thought he could come after my son, he was sorely mistaken. That afternoon, Marcus called again. There's more, he said grimly. Nick's been making noise about filing for joint custody of Jamie. My stomach churned. He wouldn't dare. He would, Marcus said. I'm sending you the paperwork now. It looks like he hasn't filed yet, but he's been meeting with lawyers to explore his options. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Nick wasn't just content to destroy my marriage and steal from the business. Now he wanted to rip Jamie out of my life, too. That night, as I sat in Jamie's room watching him sleep, I made a vow. No matter what it took, I was going to protect my son. The paperwork Marcus sent sat on the coffee table, staring up at me like an accusation. Petition for custody modification was printed in bold letters across the top, and the thought of Nick even trying to claim Jamie made my blood boil. Jamie was mine. He might not share my DNA, but I was the one who had raised him, taught him to ride a bike, and held him when he cried after scraping his knee. Nick had no right to even think about stepping into that role. But thinking about it wasn't enough. Nick was preparing to take legal action, and I had to be ready to fight back. The first thing I did was call Lisa Grant, a family lawyer I'd worked with before. She was sharp, no nonsense, and exactly the kind of person I needed on my side. "Evan," she said after I explained the situation, "this is serious. If Nick files for custody, he'll have to prove that a change is in Jamie's best interest. That won't be easy, given the circumstances, but it's not impossible." "I don't care what it takes," I said firmly. "I'm not letting him anywhere near my son." "Then we'll make sure he doesn't," Lisa said. "But you need to be prepared for a fight. Custody battles can get ugly, especially when family is involved." That evening, as I tucked Jamie into bed, the weight of everything pressed down on me. He was so innocent, so blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. "Dad," he said sleepily, looking up at me. "Yeah, buddy. Why do you and Mom look sad all the time?" My chest tightened. "Sometimes grown-ups have things to figure out," I said carefully. "But no matter what, I'll always be here for you. That's a promise." "Okay," he said, his voice soft. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, Jamie," I said, my throat tightening. Later that night, as I sat in the living room, Claire walked in. She looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should say anything. "What is it?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. She sat down across from me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Evan, I don't want Jamie to get caught in the middle of this. He's just a kid. He doesn't deserve this. You should have thought about that before you lied to me," I said sharply. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this," she said quietly. "If Nick tries to take Jamie, I'll fight him. I'll testify on your behalf, if that's what it takes." I studied her, searching for any sign of manipulation. But all I saw was a woman who finally realized the gravity of what she'd done. "Good," I said after a long pause. "Because if he tries to take Jamie, he's going to have to go through me and you." The next day, Lisa filed a motion to preemptively secure my custody rights. It was a small step, but it sent a clear message. I wasn't backing down. If Nick thought he could take my son from me, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. The decision to confront Nick wasn't one I made lightly. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to avoid him altogether, to deal with this legally and let the courts crush him. But that wasn't enough. I needed to look him in the eye and see the guilt, or lack thereof, for myself. Nick wasn't answering my calls or texts, so I drove to his condo. His sleek black car was parked out front, a symbol of his arrogance that made my blood boil all over again. I slammed my fist against his door, the sound echoing in the hallway. A few seconds later, Nick opened it, his expression shifting from surprise to annoyance. "Evan," he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. "What brings you here?" "You know damn well why I'm here," I snapped, shoving past him into the living room. "Make yourself at home," he muttered, closing the door behind me. The room reeked of stale beer and takeout, an uncharacteristic mess for someone as polished as Nick. It seemed my recent moves were already hitting him where it hurt. "What do you think you're doing?" I demanded, turning to face him. Nick crossed his arms, his smirk infuriatingly intact. "You're going to have to be more specific." "Don't play dumb," I said, my voice rising. "You're planning to file for custody of Jamie? After everything you've done?" His smirk faltered, and he looked away. "I have a right to know my son." "Your son?" I repeated, the words tasting bitter. "You have no right to call him that. You gave up that right the second you decided to sneak around with my wife." Nick's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might fight back. But then his shoulders slumped, and he sank onto the couch. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "Spare me the excuses," I snapped. "You stole from me, Nick. My wife, my son, our family's business. And now, you think you can just waltz in and take Jamie away from me?" "He's my blood," Nick said, his voice defensive. "And I'm the one who raised him," I shot back. "I'm the one who's been there for him every day of his life. You think you could just walk in and erase that?" Nick looked up at me, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't expected: fear. I'm not trying to erase you, Evan, he said quietly. I want to be part of his life. That's never going to happen, I said coldly. You don't get to swoop in and play the hero after everything you've done. Jamie doesn't need you. He has me. Nick opened his mouth to respond, but I held up a hand to stop him. I'm done listening to your excuses, I said, my voice steady. If you try to take Jamie from me, I'll make sure everyone knows exactly who you are. The embezzlement, the affair, the lies, it's all going public. Do you really want to destroy what little you have left? Nick stared at me, his face pale. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping further. Fine, he said. You win. I didn't trust his capitulation, but it was enough for now. As I left his condo, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, exhaustion, and the faintest glimmer of relief. Nick had tried to take everything from me, but I wasn't going to let him. This wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I was in control. The confrontation with Nick didn't bring the satisfaction I expected. His defeated agreement felt hollow, like the calm before the storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was waiting for the right moment to strike back. The next few days passed in a tense haze. I focused on work and on Jamie, trying to create some semblance of normalcy. Claire stayed out of my way, though her presence in the house felt like a shadow I couldn't escape. One evening, as I sat at the dining room table sorting through paperwork for Jamie's custody case, Claire walked in. She looked nervous, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. Evan, she said softly. I didn't look up. What do you want, Claire? She hesitated, stepping closer. We need to talk. I let out a bitter laugh, finally meeting her gaze. I think we're past talking. She pulled out a chair and sat across from me, her shoulders slumped. I know I can't fix what I've done, she began. And I know you'll never forgive me. Good, I said bluntly. Her eyes welled up, but she pressed on. But I need you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to protect Jamie. If Nick tries anything, I'll stand with you. I'll testify in court. I'll sign any papers you want. Just don't shut me out of his life. The audacity of her request made my jaw tighten. Shut you out? I repeated. You've already shut yourself out, Claire. Every lie you told, every betrayal, every time you let Nick walk all over me, you did that to yourself. Her tears spilled over, and she reached across the table, her hand hovering over mine. I was scared, Evan, scared of what Nick might do if I said no, scared of losing everything. I didn't know how to stop it. Spare me the sob story, I snapped, pulling my hand away. You had choices, Claire. You just didn't care enough to make the right ones. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. A part of me wanted to feel sympathy, but I couldn't. Not after everything she'd done. You don't get to play the victim here, I said, my voice steady. You made your bed, and now you get to lie in it. The only thing that matters to me now is Jamie. I love him too, she whispered, looking up at me with tear-streaked cheeks. I know I've failed as a wife, but I'm still his mother. Please, Evan, don't take him away from me. Her desperation was palpable, and for a moment I hesitated. As much as I hated Claire for what she'd done, I couldn't deny that Jamie loved her. I'm not taking him away from you, I said finally, my voice firm. But understand this. You don't get to dictate how this goes anymore. You lost that right the second you sided with Nick. She nodded, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me, I said coldly. Just stay out of my way. After she left the room, I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. Claire's desperation was real, but so was her guilt. I had to stay focused. Jamie was my priority, and I wasn't going to let anyone, not Claire, not Nick, jeopardize his future. The courtroom was colder than I expected. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the weight of the moment pressed down on me like a lead blanket. This was it, the beginning of the legal fight that would determine Jamie's future. Claire sat at the table beside me, looking fragile in her carefully chosen dress. Across the room, Nick leaned back in his chair, exuding his usual smug confidence. His lawyer sat beside him, flipping through a thick folder of documents. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Lisa opened with a strong case, laying out the evidence of my relationship with Jamie. She painted a clear picture of the life I'd built for him, the stability I'd provided, and the emotional bond we shared. Mr. Parker has been Jamie's father in every way that matters, Lisa said, her voice firm and unwavering. He's provided for him, loved him, and raised him. Biology does not define parenthood. Commitment does. Nick's lawyer countered with the paternity test, arguing that as Jamie's biological father, Nick had a right to be part of his life. I clenched my fists under the table, biting back the urge to lash out. Nick had never cared about Jamie before. This was about power, about control, and I wasn't going to let him win. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand, my heart pounding. I kept my voice steady as Lisa guided me through the questions. "Mr. Parker," she said, "how would you describe your relationship with Jamie?" I took a deep breath. "He's my son. He may not share my DNA, but that doesn't matter to me. I've been there for him since the day he was born. I love him more than anything, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect him." Lisa nodded, giving me a reassuring look. "What do you believe would happen if Mr. Nick Parker were granted joint custody?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "I believe it would disrupt Jamie's life in ways he doesn't deserve. Nick hasn't been there for him. This isn't about Jamie's best interests. It's about Nick trying to assert control." Nick's lawyer cross-examined me, trying to paint me as resentful and vengeful. But I held my ground, refusing to be rattled. "You claim to have Jamie's best interests at heart," the lawyer said. "But isn't it true that you've made every effort to exclude Mr. Nick Parker from his life?" "I've made every effort to protect my son," I replied evenly. "Nick only cares about Jamie when it's convenient for him. That's not what a father does." The hearing dragged on for hours. Every argument another tug-of-war over Jamie's future. Claire testified on my behalf, her voice trembling as she admitted to her mistakes and begged the court to prioritize Jamie's stability. Nick, predictably, played the victim, portraying himself as a man wronged by circumstances beyond his control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the judge adjourned the session. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," she said. "In the meantime, I encourage all parties to consider what's truly in Jamie's best interests." As we left the courtroom, Claire turned to me, her face pale. "Do you think we'll win?" "I'm not losing Jamie," I said firmly. "No matter what it takes." Nick brushed past us on his way out, his smirk infuriatingly intact. But I didn't let it shake me. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about Jamie, and I wasn't going to let him down. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse early, determined to keep a calm, collected demeanor. Nick's lawyer was good at throwing curveballs, and I knew today would be no different. What I didn't expect was Marcus calling me as I parked my car. "Evan," he said, his voice tense, "you're going to want to see this." "What is it?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "I found a trail linking Nick to some illegal financial dealings. It's tied to the embezzlement, but it goes deeper. He's been laundering money through a couple of dummy corporations, big money." My stomach churned. "How sure are you?" "Sure enough to have documents. I'll send them to Lisa now. You've got the ammunition to destroy him in court." By the time court was in session, Lisa had reviewed the files and was ready to make her move. As the proceedings resumed, Nick's lawyer confidently laid out their argument for joint custody, leaning heavily on the biological connection and painting Nick as a reformed man eager to take responsibility for his son. It was a compelling argument, until Lisa stood. "Your Honor," Lisa began, her voice measured. "While Mr. Nick Parker argues that his role as Jamie's biological father gives him inherent rights, we'd like to present evidence that calls his character and intentions into serious question." The courtroom murmured as Lisa handed a thick folder to the judge and opposing counsel. "These documents show that Mr. Parker has been involved in significant financial crimes, including money laundering through fraudulent businesses. This isn't just about custody. It's about whether Mr. Parker is fit to be part of Jamie's life at all." Nick's face turned ashen, his confidence evaporating as the judge reviewed the evidence. "Mr. Parker," the judge said sternly, "do you have a response to these allegations?" Nick stammered, his usual charm nowhere to be found. These are just misunderstandings. They don't have anything to do with Jamie." "They have everything to do with Jamie," Lisa countered. "If Mr. Parker is willing to break the law and deceive his own family, how can he be trusted to act in a child's best interest?" The hearing took a dramatic turn as the judge allowed Lisa to present the details of Nick's crimes. His lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. Nick looked like a man cornered, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. By the end of the day, the judge made her preliminary ruling. "Based on the evidence presented," she said, her tone firm, It's clear that Mr. Evan Parker has been the primary and stable parental figure in Jamie's life. Mr. Nick Parker's actions raise serious concerns about his judgment and character. At this time, I see no reason to disrupt Jamie's current living arrangements. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding as the words sank in. I'd won. As we left the courtroom, Nick avoided my gaze, his shoulders hunched in defeat. Claire walked beside me, her face etched with relief and guilt. "You did it," she said quietly. "No," I replied, glancing at Jamie's school photo in my wallet. "I did it for him." The house was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that felt more like peace than emptiness. Jamie was upstairs, laughing at a cartoon, his voice carrying through the halls like a balm for my frayed nerves. I stood in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkened street, the events of the past weeks playing over and over in my mind. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe again. Claire entered the room, her steps hesitant. She looked tired, like the weight of everything we'd been through had finally caught up to her. She leaned against the counter, watching me carefully. "You did the right thing today," she said softly. I didn't respond right away. My feelings toward Claire were a complicated knot of anger, betrayal, and lingering sadness. "It wasn't about being right," I said finally. "It was about protecting Jamie. That's all I care about now." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Evan, but I need you to know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make this right." I looked at her, searching for sincerity. She seemed genuine, but the wounds she'd inflicted were too deep to be healed with a few heartfelt words. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," I said honestly, "but Jamie needs both of us. If you're really committed to being there for him, then prove it." Her tears fell then, silent but steady. "I will," she said. "I swear I will." I nodded, though the heaviness in my chest didn't lift. Claire might have meant what she said, but trust wasn't something I could give her anymore. Later that night, as I tucked Jamie into bed, he looked up at me with his bright, trusting eyes. "Did you and Mom stop fighting?" he asked. I hesitated, brushing a hand over his hair. "We're trying, buddy," I said. "We're going to do better for you." He smiled, his small hand reaching out to grasp mine. I don't like it when you're sad." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I blinked back tears as I leaned down to kiss his forehead. "I'm not sad anymore," I said softly. "I've got you, and that's all I need." After Jamie fell asleep, I stood in the doorway for a long time, watching him. He was my reason for everything, the anchor that kept me from sinking under the weight of the past. As I turned out the light and walked back to my room, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. Life had begun to settle into a new rhythm. The court ruling had secured Jamie's place with me, and Nick's defeat was a final, satisfying punctuation to weeks of chaos. Claire and I were navigating a cautious truce, though the road ahead remained uncertain. For the first time in months, I felt like I could finally see a path forward. That peace shattered when I got the call. It was Marcus. His tone was sharp, urgent. "Evan, we got a problem." My stomach sank. "What now?" "Nick's been talking to someone, one of the people he was laundering money for. And from what I've dug up, it's bad. These aren't the kind of people you cross lightly." The blood drained from my face as Marcus explained further. Nick hadn't just been laundering money for small-time operations. He'd gotten involved with a dangerous group known for silencing loose ends. "He's on their radar," Marcus said grimly. "And by extension, so are you." The news hit like a gut punch. I'd thought I was done with Nick and his mess, but his recklessness had cast a shadow over everything. Jamie, the house, my new beginning. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice tight. "You stay alert," Marcus said. "I've got contacts keeping tabs on the situation, but if Nick comes crawling back to you, don't let him through the door." 2 days later, Nick did exactly that. It was late, the streetlights casting eerie shadows on the front lawn. I was finishing up the dishes when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, there he was, my twin, disheveled and desperate. "Evan," he said, his voice hoarse. "You've got to help me." I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Help you? After everything you've done? You must be joking." "I'm serious," he said, stepping closer. "They're coming for me, Evan. I have nowhere else to go." For a brief moment, I saw the brother I used to know, the one who stood beside me at our mother's funeral, who pulled me out of fights as a teenager. But then I remembered the lies, the betrayal, the chaos he'd unleashed on my life. "Not my problem," I said coldly, stepping back. "You made this mess, Nick. Now you get to live with it." "Evan, please," he begged. "They'll kill me." "Then you should have thought of that before you dragged me and Jamie into your schemes." I slammed the door in his face, my hands shaking. That night, I stayed awake, every creak of the house setting me on edge. Nick's actions had put us all at risk, and as much as I hated him, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The next morning, I found out I was right. The news broke early. Nick had been found dead in his apartment. The initial report suggested an overdose, but Marcus called me soon after, his voice grim. "It wasn't an accident," he said. "This is what I was afraid of. They're cleaning house." A wave of emotions hit me all at once. Anger, sadness, and a strange, hollow relief. Nick was gone, and with him, the final thread tying my life to his mess. As I sat in the living room that evening, Jamie climbed onto the couch beside me, holding one of his books. "Can you read to me, Dad?" he asked, his voice soft. I pulled him close, brushing a hand over his hair. "Of course, buddy." As his small body leaned against mine, I realized that, despite everything, we were finally free. Nick's choices had cost him everything, but I wasn't going to let them take any more from me. Jamie and I had a future to build, a future that no one could touch.